There we go.
Yeah. Looks just fine. You're a pro at this already, huh?
I did a lot of it for classes.
Uh,
Whoops. So in my view, I can't see participants or questions, so I will not track that.
okay, I can see there says 4 participants.
Well, we should welcome them then.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Carol.
Oh, hi, we are waiting until 6:30 to start the webinar, but welcome. We're glad you have power or at least a phone so you can join us today. Hope you're staying warm. I've got my scarf on, even though I've got electricity. It's not that warm in here.
Carol, it looks like you took this photo, huh?
I did.
It's a beautiful photo.
I'll credit my iPhone 15, but yeah, that was,
It's very clear.
yeah, it's exciting to be able to get those. You have to sit there and watch.
Did you tell the bees just hold it for a minute, pose?
And I'll say, could you pose, please?
Um,
So we know you're out there watching. We're going to start our webinar at 6:30. So Linda, do you know what kind of bees those are?
um, no, are they? They're not squash bees. Are they? They the
Starts
ones I call, huh?
starts with an S. The category. I don't know the species.
They look like what I call fly bees,
They're sweat bees.
sweat bees.
They
Okay.
are wild bees, which is why they're on this slide, since that's what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these are the ones I call fly bees. And I call them that because my granddaughter calls them that.
Uh,
She thought they were flies until I told her they were probably bees. So she calls them fly bees. We have a couple more participants, so welcome to the webinar. We're going to start at 6:30. So if you will just hang out for a little while, enjoy the beautiful photo. We'll be with you shortly.
it makes you feel kind of warmer looking at the flowering bees.
Yeah, because you know it was taken in the summer.
Yeah, it wasn't a recent shot. I actually, who was I with? Some birders. We were out doing the bird count in December, so it was late December, and we saw a bumblebee on a blooming forsythia. So I don't think either of those creatures is very happy right now.
No, but today I saw out my window in the sun, I saw a red-headed woodpecker
Oh, cool.
on my dogwood tree pecking at it. So I'm hoping there are no bugs in it, but it sure was pecking away.
That's what they do.
We have more participants. We are waiting for the 6:30 time to start the webinar. So welcome aboard, and we'll be with you shortly. Be right back, Carol.
Okay. So for those of you who are waiting, we're hoping that you're warm, and you being here means you have electricity, or maybe it just means you have a phone. But either way, we're glad you're with us. We will start the webinar right at 6:30, so we'll wait a few more minutes.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes that we're going to hang out and wait for more people to join, and welcome. And we hope you're staying warm and you will enjoy this next hour. So we'll be with you soon.
So we are right at 6:30, Linda. So do you want to
Sure.
open it
Okay,
up?
sure. Welcome everyone to the Multnomah County Master Gardener Learn at the Demo Garden webinar. That's a mouthful. We're happy to have you with us today. If you will put any questions that you have into the Q&A, not the chat, we will get to them at the end of the webinar. Today's presentation, Gardening for Wild Bees, is a very interesting subject. It's being presented by Carol Hardy. Carol teaches environmental science courses at Portland State. She has been a Master Gardener volunteer at the demonstration garden since 2021. She also volunteers as a backyard habitat certifier, helping people learn to create habitat for bees and other wildlife in their yards and gardens. And she was just voted in as vice president of the Multnomah County Master Gardener chapter. So Carol, take it away.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this chilly January day. I hope this warms you up as you start thinking about spring and what you're going to plant in your garden. And thanks, Linda. Linda is one of the co-coordinators of the co-coordinator managers of the demo garden and keeps everything moving. So we thank her for that. It is a wonderful place. So today we're going to talk about how you garden to support wild bees, the why, the how, and the what, the how, and the why. So what are wild bees? That's where we're going to start. Why are they important? And how do we grow gardens that support wild bees? I know that it is a question that we get all the time in the demo garden, and also when we're talking to folks about creating backyard habitats specifically, how do you attract wild bees? Is not, there we go. So what is a bee? For those of you who are master gardeners, I know a few of you may not be. This is a review from what we learned in our training. One, importantly, first of all, a bee is an animal, which if you look at these cute little pictures of them, how can you not want to garden for them? They are really a cute little animal. They're in the class Insecta. They are Hymenoptera. They're in the family Apidae, and there are several genuses. The ones that you're probably most familiar with are Apis, which are honeybees are in that genus, Bombus, which are bumblebees. Then there are other genuses, carpenter, digger, cuckoo, cutter, which we'll talk about some of those. Overall, there's about 20,000 species that have been described worldwide. That doesn't mean that's every species out there, but it's the ones that have been discovered and described. They range from really tiny 0.08 inches to 1.6 inches. They can be many colors, dark brown, black, red, metallic green, blue. Some have stripes. And some are much more easy to recognize than others. Bee characteristics. And the reason I'm going over this is because one of the things you're going to want to do if you're interested in attracting wild bees to your garden is knowing when they're there so you can monitor your success in attracting them. Or if you're not seeing them, realize that you're not and maybe shift your practices. So ways to recognize bees, they have two pairs of wing, long antenna, pollen collecting hairs on their bodies and legs. Those are called scopa. They have wide legs and large eyes, but they don't cover their entire face. So looking at these three guys, what do we think they are? Which is a bee, which is a fly, and which is a wasp? And if you've ever done a farmer's market, there is some cool materials that we do this for the public, is teach them the differences, and people stood in line all day to do this, and it's really fun. So a bee has two pair of wings, but that is probably the hardest thing to see. So if you're trying to identify a bee flying into a flower, I would not try to pay attention to its wings. Instead, look at the antenna, look at the pollen collecting hairs, scopa, and wide legs, and then the eyes. So this is a bee. This, at first glance, you might think it's a honeybee, but it is actually a fly, and it does have single wings, which you can kind of see here. It has large eyes that cover its entire face, short, thin legs, and no scopa, and very short antenna. I think the antenna are the easiest thing to see when insects are flying around. Wasps, on the other hand, look similar, but they have a narrow waist and very thin legs and no scopa. So that's really the giveaway between a bee and a wasp. So here's one that is puzzling. I took this picture and I thought it was a bee until I looked closely at it. So look at its antenna, eyes, and legs, and you will see that it has very, very short antenna, fairly short, skinny legs and no hair. So that is a fly. So let's talk about behavior. I know that's a silly little word there, but I thought it was cute. And behavior is really important when you're trying to create a garden that attracts these bees. And why bees are categorized as a genus is almost all bees use pollen and or nectar as the food for not only themselves, but their offsprings. Females could visit hundreds of flowers on a trip. 90% of wild bees, native bees, are solitary bees, meaning females construct and bring home to a nest without any help from other insects. They usually live for about a year. We only get to see about 3 to 6 weeks of their adult phase, which here is a bicolored striped sweat bee. The majority of their time, they're hidden in a nest in the egg, larva, or pupal stage. Social bees are about 10% of the species, and they live in colonies and they have caste systems. So here in a honeybee hive is the queen. The workers and drones are the ones that collect the honey and work in the hive. They have overlapping generations of multiple broods per year. And here is an example also of a bumblebee hive. So some bumblebee species are solitary, some are social. Since many of these are solitary nesters, we're going to focus there for a little bit. So 30% are cavity nesters. So they use either abandoned burrows and snags, or they chew out the center of stems and twigs and make their homes in them. Ground nesters, 70% of the native bees are ground nesters. So they either dig tunnels or they take advantage of other tunnels that are there. Some species line the tunnels with wax or cellophane-like secretion so that protects their larvae. Some aggregate their nests, meaning that you might see a field where there's multiple holes, so they nest together, but every female is creating her own brood. And this is typically how they lay their eggs, and this is at the larva stage where they are eating the pollen sacs that are left there. And this is how much of the life of a bee is spent as at these stages. So what do we mean by wild or native bees? And I use those terms interchangeably. So know that wild bees are native bees, species that occur naturally in a region. So they're indigenous to that region. Generally, they're associated with the native flora. So the bee species evolve with the species of flora that are in the area. Now, what starts to happen is when you introduce new flora in an area, do those species evolve with the new flora? That's what a lot of research is being dedicated to. However, native bees do adapt well to environments with native plants because that's how they evolved. There are over 700,000 species, 700,000, wow, that'd be cool. 700 species recorded in Oregon, and this number was recently updated by the Oregon Bee Atlas that does research on wild bees for Oregon State. Within that 700 species, 5 are managed meaning that people grow them, manage them. We'll talk about that too. A number of introduced species and hundreds of wild or native species, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about gardening for wild bees. The highest diversity of wild bee species is in Oregon's southern and eastern regions, and in the Portland area there's been about 100 species cataloged. It is an opportunity if you're interested at all in bees and learning about them. Cataloging bees in the metro area is something that is an initiative that Circe Society, Portland Bee Atlas are promoting so that we have a better record of who lives here in our region. So let's talk a little bit about honeybees. So the Western honeybee, Apis mellifera here, mellifera, is a single non-native species. So out of all the species, it's one species, and it isn't native to this region. It isn't native to the US. In fact, it was imported in the 1600s. There's very good documentation about when and how it came into the US and how it continues to be imported. And it was imported for probably three reasons. Is there was no global sugar trade. Sugar trade didn't exist. So honey was a main source for sweetening. It was imported, they were grown for wax. So there wasn't electricity. So candles provided the majority of the lighting source. And of course, we all like a little bit of mead now and then. So they were also used to produce mead. So if we think today about what kind of wild bees live in the metro area, we're going to focus on some that you may have seen just so you can start to recognize and remember these species. We have the blue orchard bee, which is commonly called mason bees, and they are cavity nesters, meaning they live in snags, or they chew out the center of twigs to nest in these twigs and stems. Mining bees down here are ground nesters. Sweat bees are ground nesters. Bumblebees are ground nesters. They're not shown here. A leaf cutter is a cavity nester, and a wood carder is a cavity nester. So this is important because when you're thinking about what bees you're seeing and what you want to do with your garden is what kind of homes are you leaving for these bees? So that's kind of a what are we talking about when we talk about wild bees? And now we're going to jump to why wild bees are important. So bees in general are the most important pollinator on Earth. They're the only insect that deliberately gathers pollen to bring back to the nest for their offspring, except for a few wasp species. This is a happy little bumblebee eating its nectar and carrying its pollen around. And the bees repeatedly visit one particular plant species on a foraging trip. So that's called plant constancy. Butterflies, moths, fly, wasp, beetles also visit flowers, but they're feeding on the nectar. They're not intentionally collecting pollen, nor are their bodies formed so that they collect the pollen like bees are. And some insects will feed on the flower. They'll feed on the leaves of the flower that are associated with those flowers, but they don't collect the pollen. So even though you might see a critter on a flower, they aren't necessarily pollinating it. Bees are the main and most important pollinators. So we depend on them because plants depend on them. 85% of the world's flowering plants are reproduced due to pollination. 35% of the world's crops depend on pollination, and importantly, 71% of the top 100 crop species that provide 90% of the food to humans are pollinated by bees. And as you can see, this is our rising population on Earth. This was 1950. We had a little over 2 billion people. Last year, we hit 8 billion people. So pollinating crops is a critical service, and people depend on pollinators. Over 36,000 species of native bees are used to increase crop yields. The USDA estimates 1 out of every 3 bites of food are because of pollinators. So pollinators are important. Bees are the most important pollinators. Native bee populations are at risk. So that's why we're talking about native bees and why we're talking about honeybees. Xerces Society, in combination with the International Union for Conservation of Species, reports that bee species that are threatened in Canada, US, and Mexico include 28% of bumblebee species, 50% of leafcutter bee species, 27% of mason bee species, and the main cause is habitat loss and fragmentation, meaning that even if there is habitat, it's so distant from each other, those bees really can't share gene pools, and their populations aren't supported. If you're interested, I've got the source here for this information. This is reports on many species of animals to say, are there populations that are known, decreasing, stable? So that's a great source if you're interested. And we don't even know the status of most bees because there's so many species. They live in such diverse habitats and they can be really rare and hard to find. Bumblebees locally, some of them are threatened. One of them we think is gone that we know of. 25% of bumblebee species are more rare than in the late 1800s from when we have data that we can compare. The rusty patch bumblebee is endangered. This is rusty patch down here in the corner on the right. It is listed as an endangered species under ESA. The Bombus occidentalis is threatened. Its population's declining in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a bee that we think has gone locally extinct, which is the Franklin's bumblebee. We haven't seen it since 2006. That was previously in the Mount Ashland and Mount Shasta area. So when you think about honeybees, think about it as livestock. That's how we treat it. A Western or European honeybees, again, they're not native to the US. They were imported for services. US and global agriculture systems are built around those pollinator services. The hives are transported around the country, and that is because that native bees don't necessarily meet the life cycle of some of the artificial crops that we have planted, meaning they don't grow in those locations unless we plant them. So for example, the almonds in California are not a native tree, and they flower before native bee species are active. So the only way to pollinate them is bring in a pollinator like the honeybee that isn't hibernating. In the Midwest, apples are pollinated by bees, on and on and on. So you often hear about honeybee populations are threatened. Their hives, they've got disease, or they have parasites. And that is true, that there are a lot of honeybee hives, and sometimes the bees die because they get a virus, they get parasitized. But honeybee populations are not threatened, meaning they're not at current risk of extinction. In fact, there's more honeybees on Earth today than ever historically recorded. This is the global line. This is Asia. US is down here. But honeybees are not an endangered species. They are an imported species that is grown and managed for pollination. That doesn't mean they aren't an important species and we don't love honeybees, but this is the truth about honeybees and how they move around and why they move around. And why we should be cognizant of that is anytime you transport any animal, you have the ability to transport pests and pathogens along with them. So they can carry diseases, and when they feed on flowers, if you release 10,000 honeybees, how many flowers are they feeding on? And those viruses can stay on those flowers when another bee comes to visit. Pest insect species and non-native bees can be introduced to local ecosystems, and honeybee transportation is relatively unregulated. How could you even, for example, inspect for an RSV virus? So many scientists and farmers believe that we can and we should pollinate without honeybees. So you have probably, well, if you tuned in last month, you heard me talk about regenerative agriculture. It is a movement. It is a big movement for many reasons, and one of them is because it is using nature and nature the way it exists to rely on other bee populations to pollinate crops if we provide enough habitat in and around crop fields. So cover cropping is one of the ways that farmers are allowing native bee populations to do more of the pollinating. Here on the top left, we see a hedgerow, which does provide food. It also provides its own pollinator services. This is a cover crop. This, I think, is a field of buckwheat, so it's part of a regenerative agricultural farm. The other thing, sorry, is it, and not a minor thing, it reduces the need for pesticides because when you have other crops growing or native habitat growing, you get a balanced populations of insects with predatory insects being part of those populations. So you can keep other pests at bay even while you're providing pollinators. So why is it particularly important in urban areas? So as we mentioned, one of the major threat to bee populations is loss of habitat. And here's one example of a shot of Portland neighborhoods, business areas. And as you can see, even though we may have some pockets that could potentially support bee populations, they're fragmented and very small. In the Pacific Northwest, as is true throughout Oregon, in the early summer, there's lots of pollen available, so there's less concern about wild bees being supported with food in the early summer. However, if in the early spring, if honeybees are in the area, they can compete those solitary bees that are just emerging. And in late August and September, when a lot of crops have finished flowering, there's a need to provide more pollen and nectar in urban areas and throughout the state. Again, this is a finding of the Oregon Bee Atlas. So one of the reasons honeybees can outcompete native bees is they're generalists. So they are polylectic, which means they collect pollen from a wide range of plant species. So you may see them all over your garden because they aren't very picky about what they eat. So here's 3 that are happily feeding on this dahlia. Native bees tend to be oligolectic. They collect and digest pollen from a narrow range of plants, or they're monolectic, meaning they only collect and digest pollen from a single species. And I mentioned that in the early spring, honeybees can outcompete wild bees because honeybees can travel a long way from their hives, where most native bees don't do that. They don't hibernate like native bees, so they live on their honey and their hives over the winter so they can get a jump start on populations that don't emerge until mid-spring. And many native bees are very tiny. If you remember, the tiny ones are like 0.08 inches, and honeybees can disrupt their feeding because they are giants in comparison. So people are keeping bees because they want pollinators. They understand the importance of pollinators. So Xerces Society, for one, promotes guidelines for keeping bees. If you're going to consider it, or you know someone who does, think about what the impact of honeybees are on the environment, including native insects, including native bees. If honeybees roam freely without adequate food supply for them, they will suppress local populations of native bees. A guideline is plant over 1/2 an acre of flower around your hives and avoid moving the hives around, because every time you move a hive, you have the chance to spread a disease to a new area. So what do we do then as gardeners, as landowners, as people who live in the city? How do we garden for wild bees? What are the choices that we could make to help those populations grow? Create, restore, and manage habitat. That's really the message. Provide support for every stage of their life cycle. So abundant flowers that provide blooms April to October is really critical. Give them shelter. Give them nesting sites. See this cute little guy poking his head out because he's made a home. She has made a home probably in that twig, although it could be an emerging male bee. Protect them from pesticides. And every landscape you look at, no matter how small, can be optimized to support native bees. And that is really one of the strategies of the Backyard Habitat Program is if you have a little bit of habitat in backyards, you start to create larger habitat systems so that you can support these native bee populations. So if you can look for places to avoid this fragmentation, plant some native plants, plant plants that provide not only food, but shelter and nesting to wild bees, that is really the main way to support these populations. So I'm going to focus on what we do in the demo garden because it is, thanks to many of our gardeners, but I would say one of the first of our gardeners to bring this concept into the demo garden is Bob Shaw, who is a member of Xerces Society and well-versed in native plants. And so he established primarily around the perimeter of the demo garden, native plant beds and pollinator beds in particular. So we have a variety of them. I'm just going to put my cursor out here. So if you've ever been to the demo garden, if you come in, you might have come in for the passenger, what am I trying to say? People who are walking into the garden come this way. This is driving in. This is the north hedgerow. So this is a native bed. This east bed is all pollinator plants. This area, this berm is now turning into a pollinator bed with all native plants. In this area, I'm going to show you a picture of it, but this area we are starting to introduce more pollinator plants. These two beds are native plant beds, as is this over here. They're naturescaped. They're built around large trees and they have 5 canopy layers. So all of these are creating places for not only sources of food, but habitat. And not just habitat for bees, but any kind of wildlife that lives in this area. Even our gardeners with smaller edible beds are starting to interplant pollinator plants with their edible beds. So we follow a set of principles in the demo garden that help guide how we create a habitat that supports these wild bees. So number one, plant a diversity of flower shapes and families, because many wild bees, and consider many wild bees have shorter tongues than honeybees that have long tongues. But the importance of doing a diversity of flowers and shapes, if you remember, our wild bees tend to be pretty picky about what flowers they are on. So some of them may only go to 1 or 2 varieties of the flowers that we have. So having a wide diversity of flowers means a wider diversity of bees. To ensure continuous flowering throughout the year of pollen and nectar-rich species. So I'm going to show you some examples of tools that you can use to help plan for that. It's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle, but it's really fun and rewarding when you start to know the plants and when they flower and what bees they attract. We like to use the backyard habitat guideline in the beds that we call native to have at least 50% of native plants. Many of our beds have way more than 50%. Plant single flower varieties that produce pollen and nectar. So asters are one that are particularly good. Single flowers, meaning they don't have multiple heads and that the pollen and nectar are there and exposed. plant blocks of native plants. Native plants, bees are attracted to these. So even if you've got 1 or 2 flowers in your beds, that really isn't enough to start to attract these native bees and have them decide that your garden is a good place to live. If you're space constrained, a good way to think about adding native plants is using bulbs or trees or shrubs, because they can have a large number of blossoms in a limited space. So if you are limited with ground space, that is a thing to consider. Again, look at the native plant species that satisfy the criteria of being a local native plant. This is one of these things that even our gardeners in the demo garden have some debate about is, do you cut back the tops of flowering plants if you're trying to attract insects? If you're trying to extend the bloom time, selectively cutting back tops may be a good thing to do, particularly if you've got limited space. So a couple of tools, if you've ever heard of the Chelsea chop, if you've got really tall asters or goldenrod, chop some of the plants to about 3 feet high in June. One, it'll keep them from falling over, and you're going to have some that bloom earlier in the season, other later. Same thing, if you selectively deadhead some of the blooms on asters, yarrow, coreopsis, coneflower, don't cut them all, because there are, as we said, there's bees and insects in different stages of development. But if you cut some so that they continue to bloom, that is a method you can use. Really importantly, again, provide homes for the wild bees and avoid pesticides. So create nesting opportunities for those cavity and those ground dwellers. Leave bare soil. Avoid over mulching. You don't have to put mulch on every area of your beds. Leave some bare soil. Add rock features that they can hide under. Leave dead, hollow, pithy stems. Leave leaves for leaf cutters. And even if they make nasty holes in your leaves, they are there in our gardens for a reason, and embrace them. Easy to say. Don't use pesticides. Buy plants that have not been exposed to nicotinoid insecticides, which are toxic to bees and other beneficial insects. Know your growers. This is really important. We're all tempted when we go into a big box store to say, look at that beautiful plant, I want to buy it. I don't remember the source that I was listening to recently, but there have been tests that show there can be up to 15 different types of pesticides in soils from growers that are not screening for pesticides. And even though a single pesticide may not be toxic, when they combine these pesticides in the soils, there's really unknown effects. So if you can, support those growers that don't use pesticides, and integrate pest management in your gardens to observe. And if you've got an outbreak of something you don't want, pick it off by hand, but avoid using pesticides. So just a couple of examples of what do we mean by creating habitat and what does that look like? So this is a few pictures. Probably this was late May, could have even been early June, probably late May, in the north hedgerow of the demo garden. So it's kind of fun. If you look through here, you could test yourself to see how many native species you can pick out. There's a few non-native as well, but they are great pollinators, a great food for pollinators. We've got some chickerbloom, big leaf lupin, lacy phacelia, Oregon grape, yarrow. There is some daikon radish, which was planted to break up the soil and improve soil quality and structure, and they are left flowering here. Very good for pollinators. And there is some comfrey and crimson clover that were both planted as ground covers. So come out to the garden and look at this. I mean, it's pretty incredible what's growing there, and really fun to test yourself on native plants. So here's another few examples of the native beds that we have, or the beds that we have that have native plants that support pollinators. In the top here, we have the naturescape bed, and here you'll see sword ferns. This is a mock orange, and this is a gorgeous meadow foam that is one of the first plants to come out in the spring. And it just is a carpet of these beautiful yellow and white flowers, native plant. This is an example of we call it an intercrop bed because there are multiple types of vegetables that are planted in this bed, along with pollinators that are either planted in the cement blocks around it or actually in the bed with the plants. This is part of either, it's called the East Bed Strip or Pollinator Place, seems like a more apt name for it. We've got some similar plants to those in the hedgerow. We've also got some Pearly Everlasting up here, Madia elegans there, tarweed. And this is one of the two big Pacific Northwest beds on the west side of the garden. There's two big incense cedars that are the focal points of those beds. Under them, so these have 5 canopy layers of native plants. This is a vine maple. We just planted 3 new ones. There's salal, creeping Oregon grape, which is not on camera here. This is the top of fringe cup. This is camas, more checker mallow, but this is an entirely native bed with 5 canopy layers to support not only insects, but birds and other wildlife. In the south part of the garden, we had some grass growing around. Well, it was mostly grass. There was grass that was planted to demonstrate an eco lawn, and there was some other grass planted. It wasn't, it was more of a monoculture than we wanted, I guess is the best way to put it. So we've established some edible beds here that are really intercropped beds. This is a blueberry bed. This is a vegetable bed that has a dragon in the middle of it that's outline is made of grass. But around it, this occurred just a couple of months ago. We laid cardboard and put a layer of steer manure, a layer of leaves, and on top of it, 4 to 6 inches of arborist chips. And we are going to turn this area into intercrop beds, and we're going to call it the South Meadow, and consider how else we can attract pollinators and other wildlife to this area. So if you have any incentive to work on a bed, we've got lots of room for you to help and would invite you to do that. It's lots of fun and we can't wait to do more. So one of the things that we use as a guideline for what to plant in our garden is the garden ecology research done by Gail Langelato's lab. I'm sure some of you are familiar with her work. If you're not, I have a link to all of these resources at the end of the presentation. Her lab looked at bee abundance and diversity on different species of plants, looking at some common garden plants that people plant thinking they're attractive to bees compared to some native plants. So plants that we commonly plant really focus on the ones that her lab reported as having the best bee diversity and abundance. And these 6, interestingly, also support a large number of predator populations. So other insects you want in your garden to keep pests in control. So this is a little hard to look at the first time you look at it, but this outer white circle represents relative bee abundance. So how many bees are on it, meaning how many total. The inside circle is diversity, meaning how many different species of bees, which is really what you want is a lot of bees and a lot of diverse bees. So you'll see some of the winners: Globegilia, Douglas aster is the biggest winner, California poppy, Clarkia, I love Clarkia, farewell to spring, rose checker mallow, common madia, goldenrod, Oregon sunshine, and yarrow. So interesting to look at those comparisons. This was looking at what the results in sort of a total way. So this is looking at richness. And this is a quote from Gail Longolato from her presentation on this material. She says, lavender is a popular plant with gardeners, and in part because its attractiveness to bees. However, most of the bees that you see on lavender are non-native honeybees or the very common yellow-faced bumblebee. So if you really want to support wild bees, look beyond lavender. Again, some of the big winners: Douglas aster, California poppy, farewell to spring, all of these have appeal to a diverse set of bees. So that's looking at blooms. Now we want to think about, well, what about hollow stem plants that provide homes to cavity nesters? Meadow checker mallow, again, it was appealing from a bloom perspective. Common madia is another one. Showy milkweed. So some people may find this invasive. We find that if you pull it when it gets out of control, just keep it contained. It really is a great plant to have. Fireweed is another one that has great stems. Blackcap raspberry has really stiff stems. Again, another native. Douglas aster, many species of Phacelia, and garlic stems, interestingly. So this is a great little guide that Xerces published that says, how do you create habitat for stem nesting bees? And I like it because it helps you think about what is happening in every season. And really, if you object to some of the messiness going on, think about what's happening in those stems. And also think about that if the stems are hiding under plants as they grow, isn't it better to tolerate some of that messiness to know that you are protecting these bees at all different stages of their growth? So I won't read it. A lot of what I hope is in this presentation is something you'll refer back to if you're interested in creating habitat for bees. So mason bees, here's another one of the bees that people really want to help along, and they help it by providing bee houses. So if you've ever put a bee house up, a lot of places will sell you tubes with bees in them. Xerces Society's guideline is don't ever move bees around, and they would not support buying larvae of mason bees. And they go far enough to say it's really healthier to create habitat for mason bees if you have them in a single place every year, even if you clean out the tubes so that you avoid parasites. The parasites will know to come back to where those bees are because they're always there. So if you create a habitat for them, you disperse the larvae around the landscape so they're less prone to disease and predation. That doesn't mean don't have mason bee houses. Again, all of this are things to consider if you want to support native bees. Here's guidelines if you want to create habitats for mason bees. Maybe instead of a house is remember that they forage really close to where they emerge. About 300 feet is their max range. They come out really early in spring, usually March or April in Portland. So you want to make sure you've got early blooming natives to attract them. So here's a few that are just gorgeous. This is the meadow foam I showed you that was growing in the carpet in the naturescape bed. Red flowering currant, yarrow, Oregon grape, ceanothus, Phacelia, kinnikinnick, berry, all of those are good ones. And then remember to leave the hollow stems for them to nest in to lay their eggs in late spring, 6 to 8 weeks after they hatch. again, am not going to go over what's on these slides. These are just excellent resources. This is published. It was made available through Bee Atlas. You can get these materials if you take a little quiz. And I have ordered some of them because I think they're excellent. This is a diagram that goes from the dry end to the wet end, and it shows you native plants to plant. This is really, I think, 5 different canopy layers, which is a lot. And then it tells you when they bloom, what color they are, and that's on the back of this little card. What we did, I'll credit Heidi for translating my sloppy version of this to a readable one. And this is looking at a sunbed that is looking only at small shrubs and ground covers because we have a lot of larger plants around it. But we're redoing a children's bed, and we use this guide to say, what do we want to plant in this low-growing sun garden? So that is another resource. If you're interested, here's another one from West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, which is excellent. This also talks about water needs, but similar design. These are all on the Portland plant list. I believe I looked at them, glanced at them, and I believe that was where what guide they used. If you have a large space and you want to create a meadow, this is an excellent handbook that West Multnomah publishes. It's really amazing. It's very long, but take a look if you're interested. It gives you examples for different landscapes. So just in review, what did we talk about today? What are native bees? They are bee species that evolved along with local ecosystems and the local plants. There's about 100 species of native bees that have been recorded in the Portland metro area, and they primarily live in ground stems and snags. Honeybees are not native to the US, so kind of the key takeaways for what and why are native bees important? Bees in general are the most important pollinators of plants and crops. Over 80% of plants on Earth depend on pollinators to reproduce. Wild bee populations are threatened from habitat loss and fragmentation, in particular in urban areas. This is a Portland neighborhood, and while it's an extreme, if you look around your neighborhood, my guess is you've got a lot of lawns and similar plants in everybody's yard. Again, this is part of what the Backyard Habitat program does, is give people the tools and the knowledge to diversify their landscapes. Another thing to think about for native bees is honeybees can outcompete them for food and nectar in early spring and late summer and in early fall in the Pacific Northwest. So we can help avoid that. So how do we garden for native bees? Some of the general rules: leave bare ground, snags, and stems. Let part of your garden be messy and wild. Embrace it. Understand what's happening when you leave a messy garden or a part of a yard that's messy, that you're really creating habitat. Include plants that flower continuously from spring to fall, incorporating native species with single flowers. Use and the reason for that again is some native species feed on only a few species of flowers. They have short tongues and they can't access some of the blooms on some of the ornamental plants. Use one of the many resources shared here. There's resources from Xerxes Society, Garden Ecology Lab, West Multnomah, Oregon Bee Atlas. They're all great resources. And this is a thing that we have done informally at the DG, but we're going to try to do a better job of it this year, is track the bees and other insects that are visiting your garden by plant species. Because we've actually been asked by these organizations to do that work because there is so little data about what actually occurs in the Portland metro area. And also to remember, when you leave some mess in your garden, you also attract other species. This is one of my favorite guys from last year that we discovered when we were trying to tie back some messy flowers in one of our vegetable beds. and he was hiding in there. Amanda found him. That was really cool. And this is a woodland skipper that is lavender, but there were many of them in the garden, which tells us we have a healthy habitat. So I don't believe it was mentioned that if you have questions to put them in Q&A. I see a couple there, but please, if you have questions, ask them. If you raise a hand, we might be able to call on you. That'd be up to Linda if she can see.
Okay, I can't see hands, so you'll have to put them in the Q&A. The first question that we have is from Lorna. Are the bees on the slide presentation together relative in sizes? So if one is next to each other, is it the proper size for each of the bees?
No, good question, Lorna. Those bee images were taken from this wonderful resource provided by Bee Atlas. I just picked them up to show you the detail of them. So no, that is a thing to consider if you're going to be looking for the bees. Look at a resource that gives you those relative sizes. Some of them can be very tiny.
Okay, Sheila asked, where is the demo garden located? I did put that location in the chat. I also put our demo garden email address in case anyone has any questions.
So can I just say a little bit
Yes.
more about that, because I think it's interesting. So we are part of the Green Thumb Orchard, which is a 13-acre area in Southeast Portland that has many community gardens in it. Portland State does some has some greenhouses there. They do teaching there. Black Futures Farm has a section there. We as master gardeners lease the land from Portland Parks and Rec, long-term lease. They love what we do there. But it's really an opportunity because we're part of a larger ecosystem there. And we think what we're doing there is very important because there are many beds of vegetables that are growing. And we think what we're doing to support pollinators is great for the overall habitat of that area. So come out and see. The whole place is really interesting.
Okay. Adele asked, what do you do about undesirable bees like yellow jackets?
Yeah, yellow jackets can be annoying in the late summer. We tend to tolerate them. If we did have an event where we had food out, and that's one of the worst. So there are ways to make bee traps that you could put around your property. You know, we don't advocate for killing bees, but if it's for the safety of someone, there are ways to trap them. And particularly if you do it early in the springtime, those queens are out looking for nests. And if you trap the queens, it will reduce the populations. But again, anytime we manipulate those populations of bees, we're changing something in the environment. So tolerating them is good if you can. If they're causing a threat, I would remove them, especially if you've got kids or someone who is threatened by them.
Okay, well, that is pretty much all of the questions. Couple of comments of great presentation, thank you very much, etc. So thank you very much, Carol, for sharing this fascinating subject. I like how you incorporated many photos from the demo garden because I noticed them and I recognized them. It was great. If we didn't get your question, or if you had one that you thought of after the fact, we will be sending, oh, excuse me.
I see another question from Tony asking, what methods are you planning to use to identify which bees in there on various plants? So great question. If you have any methods that you've used, Tony, we would be interested in that. I am thinking about trying iNaturalist because iNaturalist wants you to collect data because it's kind of an aggregate of people sharing where they've seen bees. We do need to make sure that we're mapping what's in the garden and teaching people how to recognize the bees so it's accurate. So we may start with some sheets of paper and some guidelines, but then hopefully eventually we're going to use iNaturalist to record them. But again, if somebody has suggestions, we are open to it. The other fun thing we're doing is Tony or Anthony Andoni from the Oregon Bee Atlas challenged gardeners to plant all species of Phacelia in one bed because he said that would be amazing for wild bees. So we are endeavoring to do that. Bob Shaw has collected seeds from all 9 species. So somewhere in the garden, we're going to have a lot of different Phacelia, and we'll be interested to see who comes there.
Okay, there's another one that came up. Helen said that when she had her native habitat assessment, the technician loved her beehive.
Your beehive meaning a honeybee hive, I assume. I don't know. So what I share here is information. So you can take the information away and consider it. I actually am going to talk to the Backyard Habitat about what we encourage people to do. I don't think that we always necessarily consider what kind of bees we're trying to attract. We do promote native bees, and we actually do promote mason bee hives. So it's all information, and as gardeners, we have to take and weigh it and make our choices. So, yeah.
Okay, that looks like all. So we will be sending out the slide presentation and the webinar recording. Hopefully by the end of this week, it'll go out to anyone who attended the webinar and others. In that, we will include a location map for the demo garden. Someone asked where it was. And so since we don't have an actual street address, sometimes it's difficult to find. So that's why we will send this location map. And then we want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and do hope that you enjoyed the webinar. Our Come to Learn at the Demo Garden webinars are held the 3rd Monday of each month, October through May. And our next session will be on February 19th, and it is about xeriscape plants for butterflies with Rich Becker. And we hope that you can join us again at that time. Carol, do you have any comments?
No, thank you for coming, and we hope everybody's power stays on tomorrow. And
yes, stay warm.
Yay.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.